Hi, everyone. Welcome to More Numbers Live, a data show focused on turning data teams from support functions into their company's engines of growth. I'm Ollie Hughes. I'm one of the co-founders of Count.co, a Canvas-based BI tool. We're all about taking data teams from being dashboard factories into their organization's problem solvers. This week, I have Callum Ballard with me. Callum is the analytics director at Omaze, and we're going to talk about all about operational clarity. Now, Callum, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here with us. And tell us a bit more about Omaze and what Omaze is all about. It's not a lottery company. It is something very special. Tell us what it is.
Yeah, nice to be here. Omaze is a charity prize draw. So started in America, but now based in the UK. So you may have seen Omaze on your Instagram or on Facebook or on TV. Every month we have kind of a multi-million-pound house available as a prize. The idea is that people can enter, it's a prize draw to win the house. The kind of twist is that much of our revenue then goes to charities. So far in the UK, we've raised over £80 million for UK charities. So recently worked with the likes of Age UK, Alzheimer's Research, just did a campaign with Comic Relief as well. We would expect that number to be kind of over the 100 million mark at some point this year. Making dreams come true with our house and our prizes, but also hopefully doing some social good as well. That's the idea.
It's a wonderful idea. I have been very much tempted by the adverts I see on social media. It's a very hard thing to ignore as it scrolls past. I'm glad it's growing well and getting more to charity as well. So we're going to talk today a lot about one of the tenets that we think about a lot of more numbers is the idea of operational clarity. We're going to deep dive into that. What you've done at Omaze and mapping your growth model is something which I think is I'm so keen for our audience to hear. But before we jump into that and go into the guts of operational clarity, maybe we can just sort of contextualize a bit of what it's like running data at Omaze. Maybe starting off actually just like where you've come from. Maybe tell us, as I love to ask, that the first BI tool or the first data tool that you fell in love with other than Excel. Maybe we'll start there and then we can go through your background a bit.
Yeah, of course. So I did maths and economics at university. So I was at London School of Economics, graduating in 2013. And like most good graduates at that time, kind of went into consulting. So spent 5 years working as a consultant at the analytical subsidiary of McKinsey and Company. McKinsey have, for many reasons, a lot of internally developed tools.
Right.
People in companies that I worked with kind of later down the line found it hilarious that, we'd have an office and we had our actual servers like in the office, like we weren't using AWS or anything like, which people found hilarious. But so the first tool that we used was an internally developed tool. The other thing that McKinsey loves to do is put muck at the start of everything they develop. So we had a benchmarking tool, which was obviously then called Muckbench, which I think was this weird like Muckbench, which was like this weird like proto SQL kind of user interface thing, which we all thought was terribly clever at the time, but probably in hindsight was an incredibly janky piece of software.
They obviously good at giving market advice. They know exactly what they're doing when it comes to naming things.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very imaginative. Yes.
Okay. So obviously then you so having gone from proprietary tooling all of McKinsey, you then moved into the world of startups. You worked at Busu, I think I've pronounced that right, where had a great fun there, been at Clio and now at Omaze. So you've then got into normal tooling with normal SQL and normal languages to write, which is really good. So tell us what it's like at Omaze now. Obviously, it's growing very quickly. So you've obviously worked very quickly onto a growing data stack. So tell us a bit more about the setup looks like, how you've thought about that a bit.
So the data stack at Omaze is a Snowflake data warehouse with Fivetran doing data ingestion from various places, DBT doing data transformation. So pretty industry standard, I would say. It works very nicely, so I'm not going to complain. In terms of the front end for our analysts and our wider team, we're using Count as our place where the analysts kind of go and do their deep work. So I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. So that's kind of where we're doing our kind of deep exploration, where we're doing our discovery analytics. That's kind of like a specialist tool that I would say for the more data literate within the business. We're then using ThoughtSpot as our BI tool. So, there's a couple of functionalities within ThoughtSpot that make it kind of a nice user interface for the end business user. There's some nice stuff for the analyst as well, of course. But yeah, so that's kind of like our main stack at the moment.
And so we're going to dive a lot more into the idea of operational clarity. And I guess that one of the things that people are always interested about is how Count and ThoughtSpot sit together. Can you give any flavor about that, like where you use for what? Because obviously we also will discuss you using Count for some of the growth model mapping, which obviously is essential to this idea of clarity, which we'll dig into. But just maybe before we dig in, how does those two things work together?
Yeah, as far as Count is concerned, I think I think about it in three different ways. So the first way, which is a bit more operational, is just like it's a great tool for data modeling. So if we're doing like DBT work, like the canvas structure just allows the designs of bags to be done like really easily. So that's just like that's a given, that's in the bag. The other two are then, I would say, making reporting I don't want to use the word dashboards, but like making reporting tools that are difficult to visually create in a standard dashboarding tool. So like a metric map, and we're going to talk about metric maps later, I guess. But that's a classic example, right? Like if you think about a metric tree or a metric map, laddering down from a single metric, like total sales at the top, and then branching off into this kind of like, multi-layered, multi-metric thing. Like just making that in a dashboarding tool is just really hard. Like a Busu, I tried to do it in Tableau and it was a waste of time. So this is a tool in which you can do stuff like that. Like there's a couple of other examples where just like it's really helpful to have charts or like kind of visual artifacts in certain positions on a page. It just makes it easily digestible for the end user. And for a tool like any dashboarding tool really that is just wanting you to have like grids of things, like it's just not appropriate. So like Count is great for that. So we definitely use Count for that kind of thing. The other thing that you would be using Count for at Omaze is, as I said, that more deep data exploration, right? So it's just very easy to interrogate hypotheses, interrogate kind of the hunches that you have as a data team, or if you want to explore performances of like, in Omaze's case, if we have a house that performs particularly well and we want to understand why, well, that's kind of the place where we go. ThoughtSpot has its advantages. I wouldn't have paid money for it if it didn't. So ThoughtSpot is more for like the quick, okay, you've got a metric defined here in a particular way. Like ThoughtSpot makes it quite easy to cut that by different dimensions, maybe chop and change different things, and it's quick for that. So it allows me, or indeed any business user that's familiar with it, just like quite easy insight that goes a little bit beyond the surface. But in terms of like then the deep understanding and then some of the more custom stuff that a good data analyst needs to be doing, like that's when we'd maybe migrate to Count to carry on that work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So really ThoughtSpot is for that kind of operational quick, I need a metric quickly kind of a decision which almost an individual needs to make very quickly from what they see. Whereas, as you said, Count is more for the holistic view of the business and then for the deep dive to actually make the business better. That's certainly what it's for. So that's great to hear. Thank you for talking us through that. So, look, we want to talk about operational clarity. It's one of the tenets that, as a more members community, we've been working at to defining the idea of these are the tenets that drive value into a business from a data team's perspective. That these are the North Stars of a data team. So operational clarity is the one of them, and we'll discuss it in more depth, being the kind of the pin that a lot of benefits flow from. Problem solving, minimizing time to decision, and then measuring yourself. We want to spend today just thinking a lot about the operational clarity, really defining that really clearly with the benefits of that. And it's something which you, as you mentioned before, you've been doing throughout your whole career at Busu, trying to build metric maps. You've been doing that at Clio, and now also at Omaze. I think you set that up from the start to have sort of metric trees and the growth model clearly visualized for the business when you joined. So before we dive into how you execute on those things, maybe we should just spend a bit of time defining the definition of operational clarity, and maybe more importantly, the pain of not having it a bit. So I guess to kick off then, I would love to just talk to you about this idea of signal to noise and just like when you've not had operational, where you've come in maybe to Omaze or other businesses, when there has been a lack of operational clarity, what do you think is what's going on? What does it look like? What does it feel like?
I think it feels like a lot of different metrics that people don't necessarily understand how they interrelate. So I think, most businesses, certainly businesses that have grown to a certain scale, they will have knowledge of like what their sales are, what their acquisition cost is, what their spend per customer is. They will know this stuff, and I don't think as an analyst you're likely to go into a fairly well established company and kind of tell them this. They're going to know this.
Yeah.
Maybe what the next level looks like is, okay, well, this is actually how they tie together, right? So if you've got your total sales number at the top, actually, like, what are the things that mathematically drive that number? How do those different jigsaw puzzle pieces that you've got in your spreadsheet in a big long list, or like in a big grid formatted dashboard, like how do they actually play together and help you to understand what's going to drive that number at the top? Because typically there will be like specific KPIs that a business cares about, normally sales. It can be other things, but understanding okay, what two things multiply together to make that sales number? Okay, take that first one. What two things multiply together to make that? Getting that structure, step one, I think, and maybe that's the thing that can be missing sometimes. Obviously, that allows you to have a view of what's driving current performance, which we do, and B, it helps you to understand actually what are your biggest levers to grow that top number. You might have a fascination with a particular low-level metric, be it CAC, be it spend per customer, whatever, might not be the most important thing once you put it in the context of everything else. So I think getting a sense of, A, how things are interconnected, and B, actually what are the bits and pieces that are the most impactful thing for you as a business to be working on to move that top line number. I think that's the introduction of operational clarity, I think, is really key in achieving both of those things.
I love the way you describe it as sort of contextualization, like context, that a metric by itself is meaningless unless you can contextualize it into the rest of the business, the other metrics that define the business. I think the what I often find is, as you said before, is that without that, people have a number, but they have no idea really. The cognitive load of working out what that number means and how it impacts the business is very high. And really, what you're describing there is the ability to let the business see itself and see how everything fits together and see what really matters consistently without getting distracted by lots of noise in a particular area. And do you, in general, when you've been into an organization where you've brought this methodology in, because I think it's something you tell that you have brought in a few times, how do you get the business to recognize they need it? Because as you say, they would quote back to you the numbers on sales, they quote the number of customers back to you pretty happily. How do you convince them that this needs to be built? That there's actually another level of clarity, another level of understanding that you could reach?
Convince is probably a strong word. I think if you do this exercise as an analyst and you do kind of provide that structure, provide that visualization, I think, if they are in the business of improving their top line numbers, which they tend to be, I think they kind of see the value. It's like seeing kind of what they know, but presented in a new and maybe interesting way.
Yeah.
In terms of like proving its value, I think it kind of goes back to the 2 points that I made before, right? Like if maybe, there was a month of sales that wasn't so hot, or maybe, they felt the business underperformed and they just had that niggle in their mind of just like, never quite got to the bottom of why. I think having that structure of, well, actually, if you follow the thread, then it's kind of, these customers didn't perform so well, and they didn't perform so well because, their average sales were a bit low, and their average sales were a bit low because they didn't buy these products. And it's just like giving that example of, you have that hunch, and actually we can demonstrate it with this piece of work. Or we can actually say, you have that hunch. Actually, I don't think that was right, because if you look at this part of the metric map, that was actually kind of fine. It's over here where your problem was. So I think, presenting those KPIs back in a structured way that maybe they're not familiar with, but kind of intuitively makes sense, is kind of nice for them. But then also starting to demonstrate value. And, once you do have those metrics set out in that particular way, like it's quite easy to start doing that. Like if you spot these areas of opportunity. So I think, in terms of winning people over, there's a lot to be said for just like, just having a first version of it. Maybe it's not the most complex thing in the world, but just like, the first 3 or 4 layers, and then demonstrating its value, pinpointing areas of improvement, areas that maybe weren't performing so well before they weren't aware of. I think that's where you start getting buy-in.
There's so much you want to unpack what you just said, that, but I think that's exactly right. And just to unpack it more, to sort of talk about it a bit more depth, you mentioned a few things. One is the idea that without kind of this operational clarity, this kind of prioritization, natural understanding of where the business is, you do have that kind of risk of people like having their myths. Like, you mentioned CAC, like we're just fixated. I've been in many businesses before where they're sort of fixated on CAC as the big problem, but actually they're sort of over optimizing, focus on a thing which is actually, say, 3 or 4 levels down. They don't have that ability to see the impact at a big level. It sounds ridiculous when you say it, but it is very easy to get distracted by the small KPIs that have got the kind of most buzz, and that buzz to be disprioritized. And then the other thing you're pointing out there is the idea that when you have a really contextualized visualization of your business, you're actually problem solving without realizing it. You actually have the root cause, what's going on, in a methodical way, and it's the start of many. It just allows your problem solving to be much more rooted in fact and impact. You're going sort of top down on a problem rather than bottom up with, this is interesting, what's going on here, kind of mentality. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think just to add to that as well, so like to take that example of, a month that's not gone so well, or like a period of time where like sales is disappointed, like if you set up the tree in a mathematical way, right? So like I talked about the idea of, a metric being broken down mathematically into two things, and then you keep on a mathematical kind of breakdown of these metrics one by one. You get to a place where you can size that opportunity like in terms that the business understands, right? So like if everything ultimately ladders back up to sales, and it does so mathematically, you can start talking about, well, this gap in sales per customer is worth this many pounds in total sales, or like this gap in acquisition cost, or this gap in retention, or whatever. And once you start being able to put it in those sales terms, then suddenly you're talking like a language that is common. People are going to understand it. People in the exec are going to understand things when you start talking about sales. And I think by doing that mathematical breakdown, it gives you that ability to take metrics and gaps in performance that are maybe a few levels abstracted from that, but then to put it into terms that everyone in the business can kind of understand.
Yeah, I love that. It's a unification. So if we were to improve CAC, what does it actually mean to the top level? Because we've got all the other factors coming into play as we go up the tree. And it just, it allows you to prioritize. Prioritization just naturally falls out of it too, as you say, in a way which everyone can buy into. That's really interesting. It's just another level of analytical maturity, right? Rather than here is sales, which is sort of the base level requirement, it's now saying here's how sales connects to everything else, and now we can start to do things like, if we were to improve X, here's the outcome of that. We actually understand the weightings of these different metrics to each other. We're now taking numbers and actually using them to explain how the business works in a way everyone can buy into, understand how they're driving towards it, and helps us to avoid distraction, because we actually have something rooting us back to where the impact is going to be as you go. That's it's really cool. Thanks for taking us through that. And the other thing which it touches on, I guess, is the idea that you can do this at a company-wide level. I think you have done that at Omaze. You've built a kind of a metric map which is linked literally to top-level sales, I guess is what you're saying, at the top level. But you can apply this logic to any part of the business at a lower level as well. Like maybe you take, because what can be a sort of the top of a tree in, say, product might ultimately be a sub-level of the bigger company-wide tree. So you don't have to start, for those listening, at a company-wide level. You can start lower down, I guess, and just apply the methodology of breaking metrics apart and showing how they fit together sort of anywhere. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, there you can, if you start at total sales, which is the example I keep going back to because that's what I personally use, but you can kind of just take that indefinitely. I mean, it's going to get really silly by the time you get onto like the 7th or 8th layer, and it's probably stopping being useful kind of beyond that point. But like, to take an example, so that tree that involves sales, I think about 4 nodes down gets to like new customers. And I kind of maybe break that down into like marketing spend and CAC.
Yeah.
and that's kind of where I'd stop, at least in the context of that tree. But clearly, like, there's a whole kind of world of insight that lives kind of beyond that. Once you start getting to things like, channel breakdowns, maybe funnels on the website,
Yeah.
There's any number of additional things you could have there. So yeah, a new tree maybe becomes, okay, these were our new customers this month. Let's start again. And by the fourth or fifth layer down, you're starting to get into some of the more relevant kind of drivers of that you wouldn't necessarily consider in that kind of grand company-wide tree that looks at total sales, but would be important for like an acquisition team or like a growth team.
That's cool. And so I want to before we can move on, I want to just make sure we capture this for someone who's listening to this show, who's going, this sounds interesting. This sounds like a different kind of role for a data team than I'm used to. I'm used to just mapping metrics on a dashboard, building to the requirements of the business. But now you're telling me that I should go away and think about mapping metrics, building a map of the business with metrics in this tree format. Metric tree is only one of many things you can do, by the way, in the concept of operational clarity. But like, what would you say to them, someone who's coming to this completely from a kind of I build reports to the business mentality? How would you help them think about it differently and help them see the need to take on this sort of bigger role?
I think the first step is that, we probably assume that a lot of the metrics are already defined, right? As we spoke about earlier, most businesses, even, ones at relatively early stages of their growth, will have a handle on most of the metrics that, I would have in the metric tree that we use at Omaze, right? So really it's just an exercise in taking those existing puzzle pieces and putting them together in the right way. And, doing that is not a trivial exercise. Like, it can easily take a couple of different goes because, a metric can be broken down in many different ways. And sometimes, if you break it down in one way, that doesn't lead to fruitful layers below. So you might want to go back and try again. But, it's a few hours of sitting down. I would even do it with like a pen and paper of just like, okay, total sales. I can break that down into the sales of two different customer segments that add together. Like, that's a mathematical breakdown of total sales. Or maybe it's total sales is, total customers multiplied by the average spend per customer, etc. Right? So all of these metrics I've just said, like, the business probably already knows them. They probably exist on a dashboard somewhere. It's just a case of taking a couple of hours maybe just to like sit down with a whiteboard with a pen and paper and just like take those post-it notes of metrics and stick them together in a way that kind of makes logical sense. So I think, yeah, the upfront work of having those metrics already there is probably already done, and it's just the organization thereof that is maybe the lift that you need to do.
I guess if they don't already exist, then there's sort of also a bigger problem, which is that the business doesn't really understand how it's growing. It doesn't really get what's driving performance, and it's measuring the wrong things, and probably relatively confused about how it all fits together, and almost certainly unoptimized. So there's kind of a two: either it should be there and you can just paint it clearer, which are all benefits we've described, or actually there's a bigger fundamental issue here, which means any work the data team does is going to be massively underutilized. And I guess the other big reason we've seen people take this on as a data team is because you have all the business data. You have the holistic view of the business. You're the one who can weave it together and support the business and understanding itself as well. So that's really helpful. Like you're right. It's not that you're starting from completely scratch. You can pick up from what's already there, and hopefully there's something you can use to start mapping things better.
I think that point around missing metrics is a really good one, actually. So like, you can get into, certainly if there's a business where like it's been the same leadership team or it's been the same kind of group of people that have been basically working on the thing for a long time, you can get a bit set in your ways. You can kind of have like, well, these are the metrics that we've just always used. And it can sometimes happen that the metrics that are appropriate for a business 3 years ago are less appropriate nowadays for whatever reason, like maturity stage, whatever. So yeah, going through that exercise and almost forcing yourself to be mathematical in the breakdown of metrics, as you say, can sometimes surface KPIs where it's just like, we literally never thought of that. We've never thought to look at it like that. And that can often is a bit strong. That can sometimes lead to like some quite interesting trails of thought. It's like, maybe if we try to optimize this by doing this, and you kind of unlock a new kind of way of thinking that maybe wasn't quite there before.
And I think this is, I completely agree. Like it's that I think the real challenge to imagine, I think, that data teams often struggle about is because we look at numbers all day long, every hour we're looking at numbers and metrics. We think these things are obvious. But actually, if you're an executive in a business which is being bombarded with information in Slack channels, emails, external clients, internal requests, the confusion, the soup they're wading through to get to understand what's really happening, what really matters, is 10 times harder than it is for, even more than it is for an analyst who's looking at the dashboards every day and is tracking these metrics, make sure they're right all the time. And it's that void of clarity, which I think is what we're really trying to close here. Is like, let the data team take the cognitive load off the business to understand itself. And I think there's one thing I would love people to walk away from what I've seen you do so well at Omaze, is just level up this simplification of the business to make it really blatant what's going on. The fact you can almost have one report, one metric tree business is completely seen in is amazing. Like that level of clarity, just one metric tree that the whole business can run by basically is amazing outcome of, and such a valuable asset that the data team can deliver to the business. And you're never going to have someone say no thank you to more clarity or more simplification. Everyone's desperately trying to make things easier to understand and help understand what really matters. And it's a data team, one of the way the data team can do that really well.
Yeah, I agree fully.
Cool. Well, I mean, so I want to dive. Got a few more questions here. One that comes from the community about how to get going on metric trees. But before we do that, is there any advice you want to give to people just getting to data who maybe earlier on in their career that you think was really helpful for you as you went through the various jobs that you've had?
I don't know if this was a piece of advice that was given to me, as opposed to kind of something that I wish had been given to me earlier. I think getting to grips with statistics is a really, really boring answer. I think is really important.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was just how it was taught or just my natural inclination at the time, but like for someone who does have a maths and economics degree, like I really didn't get on with statistics as a discipline in academia. And it's only when I kind of came back to it, in my like late 20s, early 30s, kind of through I mean I did a big science course between consulting and working at BC. But yeah, it kind of clicked a lot more for me kind of later in life. It's like, I wish I had understood this kind of, 6 or 7 years ago. And I think it's been a big unlock in terms of just like, understanding like causation instead of correlation, being able to implement like a Bayesian testing framework at Omaze, just like those little unlocks that just like I think can just elevate you as an analyst, and I do think they are unlocked by just like having a fundamentally good understanding of like of statistics. So yeah, I think that would be
I love that. I people talk about like the idea of like sort of hard and soft skills, the other technical skills are the thing to learn. And I actually think this is, if you have that desire to learn technical skills, you don't want to like lose that. I would say learn statistics more than languages, because there's actually a business facing valuable capability to learn. If you have that, you can help the business be better. And it's still technical, it's still hard logic in that way, but it's not tied to a language. And but another way, if a data team isn't the people who know statistics best, then what are you doing? Like if you're probably the base level of statistical rigor in the business. So if you're good at statistics, that's only going to mean everyone else is going to level up to your level. So it's a great hack. I love that advice.
I think just increasingly as well, businesses are starting to think about AI, and some businesses are thinking about it because that's their business model, like it was at Clio. Some businesses are maybe just like a bit scared that they're missing out on the train that AI kind of represents. And AI, it seems incredibly fancy, and it is fundamentally just like really, really fancy statistics. So I think having that grounding in statistics can maybe like, immunity is not quite the right word, but it can kind of give you a sense of grounding and a sense of proportion when kind of, a lot of AI hype is being thrown around a lot of the time. I think it can help keep your feet on the ground a bit.
Love it. Right, I've got one last question because I want to. This is back to metric trees from the community. I asked people that were talking about operational clarity, asked some questions. This one came back. We've got about a minute to answer it, but the question here is how I really believe in metric trees. I believe in the power of them. How do I get my wider business to get on board with the project? Is basically the question they're asking. How do I get started? If I could take it first, Callum, actually, one thing I would say is that metric trees are only one way of delivering operational clarity. You can turn a metric tree on its side, it becomes a process flow map, and that might be easier to get people to buy into that rather than a kind of a tree, which is slightly more visual paradigm shift than people often see process flow maps. So you could think about the key is you're just mapping metrics as a map and drawing relationships between them all. The orientation is up to you, whoever's going to get buy-ins. That's one very quick tip I would recommend to anyone I meet. Anything else from you, Callum?
I mean, to that point, I would say the same thing for like funnels.
Yes.
I think, I've often done trees where like one branch just starts becoming a funnel where it's just like X people at given stage of funnel multiplied by conversion rate at that stage of funnel. So like, yeah, to add to your point, I think the same is true of funnels. In terms of like actually getting it kickstarted and getting people on board, I think the most powerful thing to do is just to like have an example and demonstrate its capability. There's a couple of ways to do that. I think the first one is just to like have a relatively small kind of proof of concept where you are starting with like that higher level metric and maybe having like 3 layers. Demonstrating its value through one of the methods that we spoke about earlier, be it like diagnosing root cause. One other thing that we've used a metric tree for in even the last few weeks is ideation. So, we wanted this idea of like, okay, what's our next big thing? Like, what are the big swings that we're going to take as a business that is going to like continue to accelerate our growth? And like being faced with that kind of question is just like, it can be overwhelming.
Yep.
But actually, like, we just took the first maybe like 3 layers of the metric tree and just said, look, a big idea is going to drive one of these 5 things. Let's take them piece by piece and think, okay, what are the things that is going to drive this? What are the things that are going to drive this? And suddenly, like, it just gave some structure to the ideation. I think helped us to come up with more structure.
Anchoring ideas to the highest levers of impact. That's awesome.
Exactly, yeah. So I think like that's an example of, maybe, if you're in a product team that has like a regular ideation, be it every quarter or whatever, like take a metric tree to that. It doesn't have to be like 6 levels deep. Like just take your OKR as like the top, break it down a couple of levels and think, okay, what are the things that are going to drive this? What are the things that are going to drive this? And suddenly you've got like that structure of thought, and it's the metric tree that's kind of facilitated that.
That's a great answer. That's awesome. Thank you so much. We've been talking about operational clarity today. It's been amazing. We've talked about the way it can help you drive your business value, help business see it itself. You can drive critical thinking. You can use it for ideation. There's a lot of value in how you can use metric maps, operational clarity in general to do it. Callum, I'm grateful for sharing your wisdom today. Thank you so much for helping us all understand it better and think about how we can get started. Appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
No, thank you very much. It's been fun.